Good morning, everybody. Hello, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the cinema space in the new Leeds School of Arts building. We're really excited to be able to launch this season's Inside Out programme in person. My name is Marion Harrison, Senior Lecturer in Fine Art, and I'm delighted to introduce you all to today's Inside Out talk with Rose English, from the embodied object to the charmed arena. But before we get to that, I just need to do a tiny bit of housekeeping first. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm goes off, it will be real. You must leave the building by this exit here and proceed to the assembly point with Dave. The assembly points are over the road in Cafe Nero, which is adjacent, and to wait there until you can return to the building safely again. Thank you. The mission of our prestigious Inside Out lecture series is to bring the best minds of our generation to inspire and support the work staff and students do across Leeds School of Art at Leeds Beckett University. Rose English emerged from the conceptual art, dance and feminist scenes of the 1970s Britain to become one of the most influential performance artists working today. Her uniquely interdisciplinary work combines elements of theatre, circus, opera and poetry to explore themes of gender politics, the identity of the performer and the metaphysics of presence. We are particularly delighted to welcome Rose to Leeds today, as she is an alumna of the fine art course here at the then Leeds Polytechnic in the 1970s. Rose will be in conversation with Dr Kiff Bamford, who is the reader in contemporary art here, with research interests in performance art and continental philosophy. It's also really great to welcome Rose's longtime collaborator Simon Vincenzi in the audience with us today. Hi Simon. Rose and Kiff will be in conversation for approximately an hour, and then Kiff will open the Q&As and we'll finish at 1 o'clock. Rose and Kiff, welcome to Leeds.
Thank you, Marion. I'd just like to reiterate Marion's welcome and say how delighted we are to have Rose with us today. I thought it might be useful just to give you, the audience, an indication of the arc of the discussions we're going to have. As Marion mentioned, Rose's work covers making, performing, writing, working in cinema, working in theatre, working with objects, collaborating, but we're not going to be able to talk about everything. So I thought I'd just warn you a little bit and tell you that we've decided to focus on 3 projects in particular, and because we're not following a strict chronological order, I thought it might be helpful just before we begin the conversation to map out for you in time the 3 different projects or the 3 different bodies of work that we're going to address. But I'm sure that when it comes to the Q&A, if there are works that you want to ask those questions about, should be happy to address those. The 3 bodies of work, we're going to start with Rose's time here in Leeds in 1971 to 73, particularly the performance A Divertissement, and then we're going to jump forwards in time to the long project that culminated in different events in the early 2000s called Lost in Music. So we're going from right way across there, and then we're curling back in somewhat to look at the trilogy of large theatrical pieces in the late 80s and early 90s. That's the plan, but we're flexible, I hope. And that enables us to cover what the title suggests, taking a journey from the embodied object to the charmed arena. And that phrase, charmed arena, is taken from Guy Brett, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Who, Guy Brett was the author with Rose of this really valuable monograph on her work that we'll be referring to at various points. So just want to welcome you on behalf of everyone here and say how delightful it is to have this opportunity to talk to you. We're going to start with your arrival in Leeds in 1971,
Yes.
age 21, when you had photographs taken in a booth in black and white. And I wondered if you could begin by telling us something about your arrival in Leeds and what it was like at the art school.
Well, firstly, it was an amazing good fortune that I learnt about the fine art department at Leeds at the time, because I'd had quite an unhappy experience at a prior art school who had decided I should be expelled. So I was very fortunate that Leeds decided to accept me. I came and presented my portfolio. So I think that I found something that was something that I'd been searching for before. I arrived in Leeds but didn't know it really existed. It was something where the sort of kinetic nature of objects could exist alongside their static natures, and which you could practice across the board, as it were, in terms of different disciplines. It was the first truly interdisciplinary fine art course in the country. At the time, many art schools made you choose between either painting or sculpture. There was no room for any other practice. You had to do a different course if you wanted to pursue ceramics or textiles. You couldn't incorporate it into your art practice. And I'd been very unhappy in a course that was very restrictive, and, as I say, was expelled. So it was an extraordinary thing to discover this slightly startled expression on my face. Perhaps reflects that this sort of wonder that was also quite daunting because it was so open, but it really suited me. The next image is this is an image that preempts my being in Leeds, but it's the photograph that gained me a place. I remember when I showed my portfolio, they weren't so interested in a lot of the work, but they really loved this piece. And it's a site-specific performance to camera, bed in field, that I made. I think it was some months before I applied. And in these early works, they're quasi-performances. I explored them through the camera. There wasn't no public other than those collaborators and friends who were helping me make them. And it was sort of trying to find somewhere to situate these tableaux vivants or vignettes in the landscape. So it was site-specific, but I didn't know the name site-specific at the time. But I think that this somehow spoke to them, and that was on the basis of this photograph that I was offered a place.
Fascinating. And this was produced on the course from which you were expelled, but I think gives us an indication into some of your interests at the time. Is that right?
That's right. At the time, I was really interested in the 18th century. I was really interested in Fragonard and Boucher. I was really interested in eros and the erotic. I was really interested in reclaiming the image of the female nude on my own terms, although I don't think I could have articulated that at the time. I was quite new to, and possibly hadn't ever read any feminist literature at this stage, but there was something about, I loved this image, and I loved the undulating nature of the form, and the erotic that's palpably in the picture, but sort of playing with that, and the fallen flower and everything like that. And it was part of a larger little ensemble I made that included the same figure cast in resin, which I no longer have. So it was a part of a little assemblage that I made. And it preempts a later body of work that I was able to explore in Leeds that actually rendered the figure in ceramic and porcelain, and eventually those became almost votive wishes for actual performers. So it's a sort of way of figuring out through miniatures and drawings and photographs and collages something that eventually had life as a kinetic, immaterial performance.
And that's kind of visualised in these photo collages of a reclining nude, who I learned a few months ago is actually one of your sisters.
Yes.
Yes. So, and I'm reassured that Did you say co-opted rather than coerced into participating?
My long-suffering sisters and indeed my dear brother were often collaborators in my early work, either as models or photographers or filming the work. And in this instance, it's my sister Harriet, and I really like to take these photographs and incorporate them into collage. So it was a sort of it sort of shifted and changed literally the backdrop. It was a different form of site-specific investigation. And again, I think it was the taking of the photographs and, in a way, the learning how to direct the photographs to an extent, how to arrange for them, how to arrange the things in them, that led me to be able to then imagine how this might become a live event, because that was something that I was moving towards. And it was something that really, really existed in the fine art department at the time in a very inspiring way. A lot of my fellow students were practicing right across the board, making a painting during the day and in the evening presenting a performance, and it looked like the same ideas were being explored in a different form. And that's what I'd been really longing for and searching for when I left my former art school and was fortunate to have a place at Leeds.
That's really good and interesting to hear. I was aware that there was a diversity of practice in the art school in those early years, but hadn't necessarily appreciated that it was the same students that were maybe working in the different disciplines, not simultaneously, but at different parts of the day. And
yes.
Were you able to take part in other people's performances?
Yes, there was a great amount of collaboration that went on. It was also that performances were happening constantly at other places. Maybe it wasn't a big deal. It was just something that happened. You just said in the evening, "Are you going to see so and so's performance?" And they were just happening all the time, and people would ask each other to be in each other's performances. So yes, I performed in the work of my fellow student Mary Sargent and others. And also students made themselves willingly available to be in your own work. So there was a great interchange in that way. But I think it was just the working in the different forms. It wasn't that you specialised in performance. Performance was just another adjunct to your overall practice. Just a different way of actually looking at certain ideas and that they could only be really articulated in the live moment. And I was approaching that, so it was the sort of summum of what I was doing, but the other things were also important.
And teachers at the time, I mean, Jeff Nuttall was a key figure.
Yes, there were fantastic people teaching. There was, my personal tutor was John Fox, who had a company called Welfare State, so they were all mainly artists who were active practitioners and also were actually making performance themselves. So Jeff Nuttall was an important figure as well, as a founder member of the People Show, the long-standing running a theatre company. John Darling, who was a member of the John Bull Puncture Repair Kit, part of what was at the time referred to as the Yorkshire Vortex, which is a very lively, wider scene in Yorkshire, which would incorporate people like Albert Hunt teaching at Bradford and doing these mammoth, great, epic performances that students would become involved in. Kate Barnard, who's now Kate Westbrook and is a musician, but at the time was a painter. So, and a very significant tutor called Sandy Weatherston, who brought a very particular sensibility to the department and introduced me to the work, the music of Eric Satie, and things like that I didn't know at all.
And that piece played a role in your... Is it your first performance that was actually your degree show?
That's right. Inside this time of making works, including these... I gravitated towards the ceramics department, which was part of the School of Art, the fine art. One had equal access to the ceramics department as one did to any other department in the school, and I made a lot of work in porcelain china, including these little sort of erotic votive pieces, which are about that big. They're quite tiny, and I didn't quite know what they were for, but they were part of a body of work that I was moving towards making a performance with. I didn't know if they were to be worn or to be displayed or quite what they were for, but they were all part of the thinking behind the performance that I eventually made. And for my degree show, I did an exhibition of the works, and then in parallel there was the performance A Divertissement. Yeah. So in the making of that, I really did learn through the taking of photographs. I learned how to direct to the extent that I did direct and choreograph the piece A Divertissement. On the left here is my friend and colleague Joe Bartholomew, and then Di Davis, a fellow student who was also a dancer, were both in the piece.
So these are photographs of preparations for the performance as opposed to photographs of the performance?
That's right. I have no photographs of the actual performance, but I have what I would call studies towards the performance, and I'd often use, it's a form of early storyboarding, I guess, the taking of photographs to think about the ideas and to actually communicate the ideas to the performers. These photographs were actually taken by one of the tutors who ran the ceramics department, the great Dave Seeger, who was a very warm and welcoming person and fully embraced my interest in making all these objects in ceramics.
Great. And can you tell me something about the role of nudity, either in your work or at the time?
Well, that's a very big question, the role of nudity. It's a very interesting question because there's a very different attitude these days to nudity than there was in the late 60s and early 70s. It was much more commonplace then. People would often perform without clothes on, be completely naked. I think it was partly my knowledge and interest in perhaps an unthinking critique of the history of the female nude in Western art, my referencing of the 18th century erotic paintings that I was talking about, Boucher and Fragonard, my co-opting of Miss O'Murphy, the figure in the Boucher painting, into a different persona that was very highly charged and erotic, the performance itself, but particularly between the two central female figures. I remember somebody afterwards mentioning that it was very Genet-esque. I wasn't aware of Jean Genet at the time, but I sort of liked that. I thought, oh, it's Genet-esque. But yes, it was important that they were naked and that they were then adorned with these particular objects, including the cache-sexe that she's wearing, that she's revealing by lifting the little frilly apron, which is an object made of porcelain dipped in an object made of a lace object dipped in liquid slip, forming a heart shape where her genitals were. So that hence its name, cache-sexe. And then the porcelain point shoe head and the little ribbon round the neck. Again, this is one of the images of that I would have directed, where the third performer in the performance, Di, who was on point during the performance, is posing with some of the objects that were also in the performance. This is an image of some other objects that I made that are crude around it. It's almost like, again, a little miniature, because I think we're going to read an excerpt of a description of the performance. But two of the women in the performance, Jo and Leslie, the third performer, were bound up in a feather mattress, tied up with a pink satin ribbon at the beginning, which was like, and this is like a little sheet made of porcelain on which you see the genitals just placed, expectantly and happily awaiting. And that was suspended in my degree show with a fan, cooling it down because it was so hot. These are a sequence of images of an object that I made, a lace veil made of porcelain that was dropped and destroyed in the performance, which was, like, I think, the first instance that I can think of where I was placing the object in jeopardy to an extent. And what I really loved about placing these objects in the performance was they circumvented their problematic status as art objects. There was something about them being worn or being broken or being used in the performance that somehow circumvented something that I think was troubling a lot of us at the time, the problematic status of the object. I think differently now, but at the time I found it very troubling what happened to all these things we were making and where they were displayed. And there was something about the freedom that they had in the kinetic moment of the performance that I found incredibly compelling.
Because there's no video or photographic documentation of the performance itself, when this book was put together, I assume, or maybe earlier, you were asked to write a description of it in 1985.
That's right.
And I was taken by what the description reveals that perhaps we haven't seen so far, so I thought it would be useful to read it to you. A Divertissement. The audience entered and stood facing a blue ruched satin curtain, fringed with ballet point shoes. The pianist started to play, and the curtain rose slowly to the music as the dancer moved en pointe behind the curtain. Her shoes revealed flashing between the point shoes edging the curtain. As the curtain rose, the performance area was revealed. Hanging in the centre of the space was a lace veil made of porcelain. Behind the veil, on the floor, was a large feather mattress covered in ticking and tied up with a satin ribbon. Hanging behind the mattress was a large mirror. Lying on the floor either side of the mattresses were 2 porcelain cache-sex harps attached to satin sashes. On one side of the space was a plinth with a large urn full of scented flowers, stocks, lilies, and carnations. And that's, I mean, for me, the olfactory there is oozing out in a way that we haven't smelt yet. On the floor on the other side of the space, an electric fan gently purred, wafting the heavily scented atmosphere.
The dancer crossed over to the mattress, untied the ribbon and rolled the mattress back, revealing 2 women naked and asleep. The dancer crossed to the side of the space and stood watching. The 2 women woke, stretched, and started to anoint each other. They sprayed each other with perfume on the wrists and neck and powdered each other's bottoms with a swan down powder puff. One by one, they picked up the porcelain hearts and tied them around each other's hips. The 2 women then rose from the mattress and walked in a wide arc either side of the space until they reached the front. Then slowly, with the music, they walked towards each other until they faced each other and let the 2 hearts they were wearing touch, making a clinking sound of china against china. They then turned and walked to the back of the space. The dancer then crossed the space and stood behind the lace veil. The 2 women walked again in an arc to the front of the space. Again, slowly, they walked towards each other until they faced each other. They then kissed each other on the lips. As their lips met, the veil crashed to the ground, breaking into thousands of pieces and revealing the fact that it too was made of porcelain. The 3 women stood amongst the pieces of the broken veil as the blue ruched curtain slowly fell and the music ended.
Thank you. So the music was played live in the space?
The music was played live on the space, yes, and it was Eric Satie's Ginopédies music, if anyone is familiar with that music. It's, yeah. And as I said, I was informed about Eric Satie by Sandy Weatherston.
Great, thank you very much. We could carry on talking about that for some time. Maybe it'll come back in the questions, but I'm going to leap forwards now, inspired by your mentioning of the unstable objects,
Yes.
to this project Lost in Music, and we're going to have to do a little bit of a juggling time-wise, because what we're looking at here is an installation shot from the exhibition at Camden Arts Centre in 2016, but it's showing in backlit display some of the notes that Rose was making at the beginning of the Lost in Music project, and if we fast forward to this piece, it shows some initial notes to the Lost in Music project dated 1995, and given that Lost in Music continues through to today, to 2016 at least, it's a long project. Shall we pick up on some of the notes here?
Let's pick up on that. And as Kiff says, this is quite a long jump between the work in 73 that I made when I was here and this body of work, and there was a lot of work in between that got to this point. So I'm jumping in. We're jumping in at the deep end with this other body of work because of the connection with objects and vessels that it was exploring. So Lost in Music was an overarching title taken from the the famous hit song. Just remind me, I've suddenly forgotten the name of the great Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards. Yeah, and Chic, and that song, which I really love, because at the time I was really when I started work on it, it was something about this phrase, "We're lost in music, caught in a trap, no turning back, we're lost in music," which made me think that it was the lyrics themselves singing, "We're lost in music, we're caught in a trap." And at the time I was really interested in the split between the word and the image. So that particular great work, that great song really resonated and informed this body of work that I then made. I started work on it, as you can see, very early on, and I constructed what I call a storyboard, which was made up of text, image. So it was also about the wanting to find the place in between the image and the text. During the time that this one was written, it sort of mapped out in almost haiku form the phenomena that I was then going to explore for the next 10 years, which were glass, flying, fire, singing, and acrobatics. And I was wanting to find the sort of parallels and the opposing elements of those phenomena. I didn't quite know where the work would take me, but it was the beginning point and the origin. Along the way, I would sometimes make a very... Did you want to say anything more about this one particular? But along the way, these particular pairings would be just two words, and in this instance, you can see that word ornamental happiness was in itself a whole little world, which led me to my great good fortune to visit China. And the pairs of words, ornamental happiness, were paired with an image that I had at the time of a young Chinese contortionist performing a very old traditional Chinese act called guanbei, or rolling cups. And that then became a performance in its own right. So this sort of the storyboard and the investigation of the work opened up to present 2 or 3 different performances along the way. Sounds very complicated, but I think it will become clear. What was particularly interesting to me about the work of the traditional Chinese acrobatics is the extraordinary work they do with objects, and how the object is kinetic in the skilled hands of the acrobats, and how the object is presented to the audience from all sides. So it's about the kinetic object being handled with great skill. It's also about the object being placed in peril or in jeopardy. And there's a tradition in Chinese acrobatics that you always add an additional element to throw the acrobat slightly off balance, or to demonstrate that their skill is so great that they can have an element of difficulty added into the work.
Would it be a good point to show the first film?
Yes, this is a short excerpt from one of the first performances made under the overarching title Lost in Music, called Ornamental Happiness, that featured 2 young acrobats, Lu Dan and Ji Ma Ling, from the Zhejiang Acrobatic Troupe of China, performing their a reimagined version of their act itself. And shall I say a little bit about what they usually work with these tiny glasses that they're balancing on their hands and feet. And these particular glasses you will hear produce a tinkling sound. So perhaps I'll tell you why that tinkling sound is there. This was presented in Liverpool. Also present, there were 4 singers and a percussionist playing. So let's play that.
Should we play that first, Bill? that was in Liverpool.
Liverpool Biennial, that's right.
And the audience is surrounded not only by the objects in peril, but also by the singers who are behind them, singing
That's
live.
right. The set and the props were designed by my long-term collaborator Simon Vincenzi, and it was like a tiny circus ring, like a jewel box circus ring, a little tiny revolving platform. So it was actually moving very slowly, that platform as well, just to make it even more challenging. And the singers were walking in an orbit behind the curtains that were at the back of the little auditorium. I think there were about 3 or 4 rows of raked seats in the auditorium, and they would sort of come in at the little side entrances every now and again and sing their particular phrases. And the percussion and the solo soprano never was seen. She would only be in an outer orbit around the space. So it was a very intense experience. And it was important to me that the audience saw what the acrobats were doing it in extreme close-up, because I'd seen so many acrobats in China presenting their work on huge stages, and it's almost like you forget that it's actually the extraordinary muscular control and sinewy balance of the acrobats which is really coming into play, and I wanted people to be able to witness that up close.
And of course the sound as well of the glass.
The sound of the glass was also a very important element. The glasses had this very clever mechanism that Simon designed of a wobble, which made the muscular tremor as they adjusted their balance in that tiny incremental way would be reflected in the wobbly glasses. You probably saw they were moving very slightly, and each glass had a tiny glass speed in it, so it chimed with every muscular tremor as well.
And in terms of you talk about your notes as a libretto that
Yes.
was given to the composer when the music was commissioned, is that?
Yes, there are two works of music commissioned from the composer Luke Stoneham. The first was for Ornamental Happiness, and then the later one was confusingly for the earlier photograph we saw for the piece that happened in Camden Arts Centre. This space itself was filled with a 70-minute long piece of music for 9 singers and percussion and solo soprano that also had a sound design. So as you looked at the libretto score, the storyboard on the walls, you would suddenly hear maybe one of the phrases that you were reading on the page it coming through the space, through the speakers. I think there were 40 speakers we used. So it was, again, a very intense experience musically.
And the description you make of the connection between the breath of the singer and the breath being used in blowing glass is something I've really taken with. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, I think there was something about looking at the phenomena, these very different phenomena, and also finding a way to juxtapose extreme forms of virtuosity as well. At the time, my interest in glass was looking at the fact that glass actually gets a disease. Certain forms of very, very highfalutin Venetian crystal, because they put too much lead in, means that the object renders over time, over hundreds of years perhaps, becomes inherently unstable and has this disease called crizzling, which means that the object itself, even though it's been annealed in the annealing oven, will suddenly implode and go back to nothing. And this reminded me a lot of a quote that I was very taken with at the time, that I will recall in a minute, from Walter Benjamin about the angels. New ones each moment in innumerable bands are created, so that after they've sung their hymn before God, they cease and dissolve into naught. And this was both reminded me of what happens to a word when it's spoken or sung. It's articulated, it hangs in the air, and then it goes back to the nothing. Or the vessel that has crizzling that will suddenly implode and go back to nothing. So there was a sort of, it felt that there was this parallel to all these phenomena. Yeah.
So there's a possibility of the object ceasing, but not necessarily in the literal way that it did in the Leeds piece, where the veil crashed down and smashed before our eyes. It's more as a possibility, either in the production process or in what we just witnessed there with the object in peril.
The object is in peril, but the object's in the hands of supreme performers who are deeply skillful, and that was very key to when we got the risk assessment for the next performance we're going to be discussing. The fact was that the objects, they're in very sure hands.
Yes.
And it was an extraordinary process to collaborate with those acrobats, because they taught me so much about their own objects, and they had to, of necessity. I was able to spend quite a bit of time with them as they sort of broke down their act and explained exactly how they needed to support the conditions they needed to do their work. And that was a very big part of my learning to direct, is learning what the conditions are that the different performers I work with require to be able to do their work well.
So in terms of choreography, you're working with the conditions under which they're able to do the phenomenal work that they do. It's
being able to try and understand them, and therefore think about whether what I can ask of them that will honour what their conditions that they require are, but to do something a little bit different with them. Yes.
And I suppose there's a parallel with the singer as well.
Yes, there is a parallel with the singer as well, absolutely. And that's something I've learned particularly through collaborating with a composer like Luke, who enjoys working with singers.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another element to this project, Lost in Music, is working with the National Glass Centre in Sunderland, and I don't know if any of you've been, but glass blowers blow glass live to sometimes working with students there, sometimes to visitors, and in this case to visitors to a promenade performance, if I'm right.
That's right. At the time, Gronia Sweeney, who was the director of the gallery at the National Glass Centre, had got wind of Ornamental Happiness, and she approached me to see if there was a project to be done with them. She heard that there was a strand of glass that I was interested in pursuing, and so I devised this promenade performance, which enabled me to invite another group of acrobats I've been working with, in this time from the Shanghai acrobatic troupe. I'd already done quite a long workshop with them in Shanghai, working with a group of 20 of them, to invite 3 of those young acrobats who work particularly with objects to come to National Glass Centre, where we would then make their objects, objects that were usually performed with, which were in ceramic, to actually render them almost as ghost objects in glass. And these are exact facsimiles. They had to be the same weight, the same shape, but they could be in a different material. And it was a great challenge for them. I then presented, I think it was 4 vignettes around the Glass Centre that the audience would walk around in a particular order and watch, that was juxtaposing 2 forms of extreme virtuosity, acrobatics and glass blowing. So the audience witnessed the object being rendered in glass in its entirety, because it takes a long time, and then presenting the object annealed, one that was annealed previously. So we cheated a bit to the acrobat, that you then saw this object, which had taken 45 minutes to make, then be perhaps balanced on the end of a nose or some other extraordinary action.
Great. And you get a sense of this from the short video excerpt that I'm going to ask.
Yeah, perhaps we should just show. Yes, I think there's a few. Yeah. There's a couple of its slides we should show first.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
That this is. I think I just mentioned the young nose balancer who we watched James Mascray and his assistant Kalki Michaels forming these extraordinary drinking glasses that were then put at the final top of this extraordinary pile. And then the other vignette was with this is a look at a tabletop display of the objects in the Camden show that we did make for the acrobats, including the Diablo, this glass that was balanced on the end of the nose. This plate here is for a plate spinner. But this is the object that we're going to watch. Jiang Bei Huan was one of the acrobats who came to Sunderland. He practices a very old Chinese acrobatic act where he balances and juggles these two jars, a small jar and a large jar, on his head. And he gave a display, first of all, working with his usual ceramic jar, which we're just going to watch a short snatch of. And then the audience watched while his ceramic jar was rendered in glass. And he then had his first tentative try of seeing if he could juggle with it, which he did amazingly well. So.
Sorry, I jumped.
That's
I jumped
okay.
the slides. Thank you. I'm very aware that I'm doing an injustice to aspects of your career by swooping from one body of work to another, but the emphasis you're putting on the virtuosic there, both of the performer and the craftsperson, shoot me down if I'm wrong. In some ways, I think he's explored or exposed or subverted in aspects of your large theatrical works that we're going to very briefly mention. And in order to set this up, I mentioned at the introduction that we're going to go back to the first of these in 1988, but it's only fair to say that having left Leeds, you worked with Sally Potter and Jackie Lansley, collaborating on performances and film work. You also did solo work, perhaps most famously Plato's Chair, which toured Canada and had many performances, in which you are starting to play with philosophical ideas, quite complex philosophical ideas, in front of an audience that Rose, in character, really feels may not be paying adequate attention, and therefore tries to ensure the attention is kept by putting Mickey Mouse ears on, for example. And so there's this series of solo works, and what I'm leading to is the fact that in 1988 you end up moving to very large scale, long duration pieces in traditional theatre spaces, proscenium spaces, and I wondered how that happened and why it happened.
Thank you, Kiff. That was such a lovely summary of, of decades, actually, really beautifully encapsulated. Yes, it was a surprising move. It had been preempted, as you say, by this period of time, performing a lot of solos, very pared down monologues, a lot of them were, and I performed them a lot in gallery spaces and in studio theatres, so not on proscenium stages. This is an image of a collage I made of the Hackney Empire, one of the great 19th century old proscenium stages in London. Around at the end of the 80s, I was asked often to MC and present award ceremonies or galas. I don't know, I just became, for a very brief period, the person people would go to for that. And I found, much to my surprise, and they were often on proscenium stages, I really enjoyed introducing lots of people who had very different skills. And I also found, to my surprise, that the physiology or the psychic sort of relationship with the audience from a proscenium stage was the actual opposite of what I anticipated it would be. I always thought it would be the epitome of being set back, separated from the audience. To my surprise, I found that at the time I was doing a lot of work with audience interaction, that an audience felt very relaxed in a proscenium stage. They felt safe, or they felt embraced by the space, and so often would respond more than my experience had been when it was in a studio space or a gallery. And I enjoyed that. I was also very interested, I'd always been very interested in theatre, and I was also interested in the extraordinary, what I would call the Renaissance machine of the proscenium stage, and the fact that they're designed to make a particular convention of scenery fly out and fly in into the fly tower. And I became very interested in that vocabulary and that tradition of representation. So it was an interest in theatrical representation which drew me into making that trilogy of works. Plus, I just had enough of being solo, and I wanted to have some really great people around me on stage as well.
And you still maintain a presence in all three pieces?
Yes, I was performing in all three pieces. All three pieces were usually preceded by, again, it's sort of a reference to the sort of early performances to camera. I'd always make an early sort of representation of what I was then going on to make. I call them performances to camera, but they're sort of anticipating the show to come. And I'd often refer to them during the performance, as we'll see later on. The first of this trilogy was called Walks on Water. As you say, it was at the Hackney Empire. It featured a group of 12 men as a chorus who changed costume throughout the piece in the three acts of this performance. It was incredibly long. I think it was about 120 minutes. I was told to make it shorter, and in my attempt to make it shorter, I actually made it longer. But it was a riot in a way, because there were fantastic people in it. This chorus of 12 men who also had 12 daughters during the performance, and they were portrayed by a children's dance troupe. I also had an acrobatic double, a stunt woman who made it look as if I could do the most amazing things. We were dressed identically.
There are some stills from...
Yes, so this is Act 1. I think it's called the Beginning of Love, is it? Act 1, Architecture, the Domain, was set in this Bibbiena reference. Bibbiena was a great scenic designer that this backdrop references. Again, these three works are all designed by Simon Vincenzi, all in a very different way. In this particular instance with Walks on Water, we made use of stock scenery to an extent. With this was ready produced, so it was a found object in a sense, but very cleverly found. And the later two acts in the performance were the scenery was actually designed and made for the show. In this instance, the chorus of men are patriarchal figures, echoing and agreeing with what I said, which in the tradition of a sort of reversal of a Platonic dialogue in a way.
Because you like audience interaction, would you interact now and repeat repeat the last word I say of a sentence? So I will be Rose. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was doubt. And the Word was dwell. The word was domain. The word was vista. You've got to crescendo as we go. The word was view. The word was vault. And again, the word was doubt.
Wow.
Thank you. And in many ways, doubt is one of the key themes in this work, isn't it?
It is indeed. It was made at a very intransigent moment politically, and it felt that it was placing the whole country in peril, this intransigence that somehow refused to acknowledge that it might be wrong, and therefore implicated us all in the downfall that might follow it. So there
This is Clause 28.
Clause 28, the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, the very, very hostile and it felt like an incredibly intransigent political climate that could only be subverted by joy, because that was the thing that it really, really lacked. So it felt that to actually make something joyful was quite subversive in some ways at that moment. This is an image of Act 2. I think this is the one that's called The Beginning of Love. Yes, Act 2, which was set in the forest. So again, referencing a particular tradition of representation of the natural world with the soft scenic background. And these brilliant trees, a chorus of change from bearded patriarchs into a chorus of trees, who demonstrated many things, including their own resistance to ill winds of all kind that were blowing at the time. This is the daughters of the patriarchs, who are now, when Act 1 were presented as babies. Each of them was presented by a baby by the acrobatic double, and in Act 2 they had grown up into this children's dance troupe who dances beautiful.
And this is a dance troupe that was touring at the time.
Well, the composer and musician I worked with at the time, Ian Hill, was an accordionist, and he played for this children's dance troupe and introduced me to them, and we invited them to be in the show, and they were so great. They even brought their own costumes.
Fantastic. And the last.
That's right. This is Act 3, The Waterfall. And it is Revelations, the waterfall. I think there was an investigation of fallibility and infallibility and the idea of miracle through the piece as well. And in the last act, the stage was stripped right back with these trees at the side and a scenic painted backdrop of a waterfall, through which at a certain point there was a traditional scenic reveal through the gauze of the painted backdrop to see a real waterfall filling the expanse of the stage with real water. So
We have a video. Is this the right place in terms of the sequence, or do we have another
yes,
slide?
I think this is the right place to show that.
we have an extract which I think sums up the tone of the piece, and that what you mentioned in terms of joy being the response to a climate of intransigence and fear, kind of sums it up. If we could watch that, that'd be great.
Okay.
This would be an ideal moment to do our fish dive. The deep, the depth, the water frozen, the water not yet flowing. Oh, the still water on which I will attempt to walk. Because that's all some people ever come to see. They say, will you actually get to walk on water? And they're not content when I say, well, perhaps, metaphorically speaking, and only on a good night, I will. No. They want to really see me do it. And I don't like to disappoint. And I'm going to try that now. Shall I? Yes! Very well. Remember this from Act 2? The forest pool. Suddenly, strangely, in the middle of the firmament. But still tremendously deep. Very deep and full of real water. I flick it about to prove my point. Bound to be able to walk on it. Bound to. Especially if you believe I can. Oh, I could feel a little doubt in the audience. Just a little smidgen. Quite put me off my stride. I'm going to try again. Oh, no. A few people are still doubting. I think there's somebody called Thomas here tonight. Now then, please concentrate. And I'll try to do it now. Oh! Well. What do you think about that? Not bad, eh? It's a reinterpretation. It's called walking in the water. Not quite what I had in mind, but sort of interesting anyway, don't you think? Neither one thing or the other. Fixed here, between the deep and the firmament. Firmly fixed. Oh. Tremendously wet. But very interesting. As reinterpretations often are. also baffling and also flummoxing. But I know why I didn't get to walk on water then. It was because I wasn't wearing the costume I'm wearing in the publicity material. Now, I often think it's so disappointing when you go out to see a show and you're lured in by an alluring image. And you think, yes, I'd love to see that. Just like that. And you go along and you see a woman in an old cistern in the middle of the stage. Tremendously disappointing, but also interesting. Now then, out I come and slip in to that outfit that I have on in the publicity material.
Thanks. I think that gives a really good sense of the humour in much of your work, and the subverting or the drawing the audience into all the constructs that are present in such work. That's great. Yeah. Shall we?
Yes. Just to show, that's the image of the gauze with the waterfall painted on it, and then the chorus are able to summon up the water ballet chorus are able to summon up the real waterfall that appeared behind the scenic gauze.
At the very end.
At the very end, that's right. We see the miracle.
I'm conscious of time. I want to leave time for Q&A. But the reveal of your costume at the end of there links very nicely to the next piece in the trilogy, in terms of the double wedding. And I did actually highlight a little something from that, where your character as the hostess in the double wedding, and this is the publicity shot that shows Rose with a glass walking stick, which I think is very important in terms of the connections we've been making with material. And here, if I can find, you say, never before in a show has the sequin featured so strongly. Never before in a show has a sequin had to represent so much and so little at the same time.
Oh, I'm really delighted you picked up on the on that Kiff, because the whole set in the double wedding was again designed by Simon Vincenzi. It was completely made of this space was constructed on the small proscenium stage at the Royal Court, which is smaller than the Hackney Empire. It was this little world that was all the curtains were covered with black sequins. So it was a glittering dark world that you looked into, like the most glamorous black hole imaginable. And with these little mirror balls in it as well, and concealing in the centre a vortex curtain that concealed a real ice rink. It's a hard show to summarise.
You've got to say what happened on the small ice rink.
Oh, well, at the very end of the performance, the world professional ice dance champions danced an adagio, a very close duet, on this 12-foot real ice rink at the very end. But we'd been very, very inspired by going to see all these different traditions of theatre, like burlesque, like the revues in Paris at places like the Lido and other shows like that, and how it was also a show that was about different art forms falling in love with each other. What happens when film falls in love with theatre and wants to be theatre? What happens when a piece of theatre wants to become a film? What happens to all these fictions that exist in the world that happen in different forms, as operas, as ballets, as stage shows? So that was an investigation through it. She was the most extreme persona I've played, the hostess. She was pretty brittle and demanding, but that was the sort of the apotheosis of a particular political climate that existed at the time, and she was in a way an embodiment of that, even though she was so glamorous.
And I feel like I'm plugging this book, but it really is so good. The text is in here, you know, and they are a joy to read. So I do recommend them, because obviously it's very difficult to encapsulate a trilogy of shows, each of which lasts more than an hour in a few moments. But I'm hoping that we get a sense of them here.
All the characters in the double wedding were in pairs. There were 2 hypnotists, 2 cameramen, 2 characters called the Viscera. Everybody had a double. That was a very important element. And there was also a scene, as you can see in the centre image, there's a scene with me wearing a silver dress talking to the late, great Nigel Charnock. There was a scene where all the cast members travestied me. They all suddenly appeared dressed like me and impersonating me, as a warning to ever assuming that anything you do is an absolute, and sort of calling me to account. There was also a scene that referenced the sort of floor shows and Lidos, and like you get at the Lido in Paris, and the some of the characters were dressed as traditional floor show dancers. And there was a scene about the homosexuality of the scenery itself, a dialogue about that and whether it was concealed or revealed. And there was a whole sort of dialogue throughout it. And it was sort of an amazing company of performers that were assembled for that show.
And that sense of hiding and revealing that was in the clip we saw from Walks on Water with the feathers at the end, it just shouts out to me the connections back to Divertissement as well. You know, that idea of having a cash sex that hides the genitals but draws attention to them. And there's a lot of that posturing going on that the unsaid is drawn attention to in the way that things are staged. Yeah.
Yes, that a certain extravagance is present in signalling itself to the audience in both those bodies of work. Yes, it's true.
Very well put. Good.
This is the scene I was describing where the audience, not the audience, the other cast members all appear as in drag. It's mimicking me and my gestures. It also had long soliloquies which were quite esoteric about the nature of looking. So it really juxtaposed these very entertaining scenes with these quite mysterious meditations on the nature of the hermetic inside the piece. This was a dialogue where there was a discussion about whether the scenery was homosexual or not, because it both conceals and reveals. And and here we have the world professionalized dance champs dancing their beautiful duet at the very end on the tiny ice rink.
And you described the fact that the audience could hear the blades on the ice.
Yes.
This is the last in the trilogy, and Tantamount Esperance features Rose dressed as a man, as a magician from the 19th century, who is somewhat melancholic about the faded glory. Would that be fair to
No,
say?
the state of the state of the state of
The
things.
state of things.
No, he's not nostalgic, not
Right.
at all. He's actually waging a personal war on nostalgia. It's about that moment in time. It was approaching the millennia, and there seemed to be an awful lot. So it was presented in 1994. There was already a lot of talk about the millennia, the year 2000, and he was very troubled by the things that were being said about it. So it was like a 19th century seance, but about a 20th century malaise.
And
It also was at the Royal Court Theatre, and it employed the full volumetric of the space. There was some very amazing special effects in it. I collaborated with a stage illusionist called Paul Keeve, who presented himself some classic magic illusions, but we also made use of flying techniques new that we actually developed specially for the performance, so it looked like a body will hurtle through the space with velocity and speed and power inside this very heightened world. It's very spare, the language in Tantamount Esperance, and it was necessary to float the language, which is quite dense as well and spare, against the music that was a constant. There was a tango trio playing throughout the performance as well. He was troubled, a troubled figure, Tantamount, but I have great affection for him. His associates were all immortal beings who ostensibly gathered every 1,000 years to debate the nature of the soul. Here they are assembling at the very beginning of the performance. That's Tantamount, and then Espiritu la Verdad, Epitome Plaisir, and the other characters all assembling. This is Espiritu la Verdad walking on air, and would then ascend up into the air. So again, the audience would see everything happen. It was also really important that the magic was just happening throughout, so you would not necessarily announce it. It would just be quietly happening, something miraculous in the corner of this incredible space, delineated by these silver lame curtains and flooded with this violet light. This is one of the illusions presented by Paul Keeve in the duration of the performance. This is myself as Tantamount Esperance with Imogen Grave, her name was, a very complex character whose name is refers to the graven image. And she talks about cleaving her name to herself. And the Tantamount and Imogen dance a tango at the end of the piece.
And Tantamount Esperance means tantamount, close to the equivalent to both waiting and hoping.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which had a very particular meaning at the time.
It did. They're somehow their sort of psychic names were a very important part of developing the piece. Yeah. I could read. Is there time for me to read this short?
Shall we have
To finish?
Have the reading to finish? We have one last slide that concludes with.
That's right.
Yes. Is that work?
Is that too much? Okay. So this is a speech that Tantamount gives quite near the beginning, and this is a photograph of me making this speech. I've forgotten what tawdry means, possibly because I've become it, all dusty around the lapels. My home is an infinitely, sometimes interminably humble place. I've come to realize recently, to my chagrin, that young and struggling is so much more glamorous than old and struggling. Knowing this makes it no easier. All endeavour, you must remember, is miraculous, even if ultimately futile. Evidence is no guarantee of remembering or being remembered, although even the ephemeral can have a sort of permanence. Millennium, they all say. We approach the end of the millennium. What is this time? What is this time? Fever, they all say. There is always fever at this time. But I say, there only seems to be notoriety and expectation of fever, in time and out of time, of your time and not of your time. I have been waging a personal war on nostalgia, on what I perceive to be an inability to embrace an idea of a future. These days, people use entirely cautious language when speaking of the future, as if they are afraid their ideas might be proved wrong in time, even before they've had the courage to have them. I don't want to sound bitter, but I am. I've tried to fight it, to put on a jaunty air, but there's no disguising a heart that has been harrowed to the core. What has happened to our sense of eternity, that infinite future stretching in front of us? We cannot see it because we have forgotten the past and are not even noticing the present. It's like being in the middle of learning a language and you have no tense apart from the present. You cannot communicate anything you've done or anything you might do. It's all so erratic. You need a sense of space from in front and from behind you to be able to think.
And I thought we would end on this final slide. I hope it is that I've got it right, which maybe brings together the idea of an embodied object and a charmed arena. This is a pair of lashes that was commissioned by Rose as part of a performance. And what were the instructions you gave to the jeweller?
Yes, a jeweller called Simon Fraser. I just wanted to have a really, really, really long pair of eyelashes, truly giant. And they came down to about here. And during the performance, he made me a whole trousseau of them, which was really wonderful. And during the performance, I would invite a member of the audience to come up and trim them with a giant pair of scissors. So